Hey, what's up, everybody? Jack here with DevSlopes.com, and we're back with our API course. We're really going to get into the meat of things today. We set up our project folder in the last video. In this video, we're going to start building it out, and we'll just go from there. So, we got a few things that we need to add here. If you'll remember from the last time, we've got our source folder. And we've got Babel set up where everything's being transpiled and copied into dist. So now we need to actually set up our app. So, in our app, we need to import a few things. We need to import HTTP. And HTTP is an object that's going to let us actually create a server. We've already got Express imported here. We need to import body parser, which I talked about in a previous lesson. That's going to allow us to parse the JSON out of our request object. And we need to import Mongoose. Mongoose is the ODM that's going to let us interface with MongoDB in an elegant way. And then we've got some of our own imports that we want to pull in here. And we're going to have a config file and we're going to have a routes file. So we're going to do import config from, and then to import one of our own modules, inside the quotes, we need to put the /, which means our current folder. And then we need to add config. And then we also need to import routes. And so our routes are actually going to be the part of the URL at the end, where you've got say you've got api.devslopes.com, and then your actual route will be the /API/v1/ whatever. So this routes file is going to take us to where we need to go. So once we've got all that imported, we need to come back and we need to say let app equal express. We need to create our app, and then we need to say app.server equals http :create server, and then we need to pass in app to that. And that's going to get us up and running there. Now then, we can add middleware in here, and at some point we're going to have a passport config in here. I'm just going to put comments in here for now. Okay, and then now we're going to get to our API routes. And I think we talked about middleware back in the code along we did. But middleware is code that lets us intercept a request before it gets to our handlers and do some kind of operation with it. And we'll need that before we move on. But anyway, so we're going to go ahead and set up our routes here. And we're going to say app.use. And then we're going to set up v1 here for the URL. So anything coming to /v1, we're going to send to routes. And if you'll remember, routes is what we imported right here, which we don't have that set up yet. But anything coming to our URL /v1 is going to get sent here. So then all we've got to do is say app.server.listen, and then we got to specify our port. And I'm going to say config.port. Now config is an object that we don't have set up yet either. You see here we've got it imported, but we haven't created it yet. We're going to specify our port in this config file. And then we're going to console.log a message out to the console. So we're going to console log a message here, started on port. And then we're going to look at the app.server.address.port here. And that's going to tell us the port that it's actually running on. We're going to log that out to the console. And then the only thing left to do is we got to export default app. Now this default keyword works with import. You can't use that with require. But basically we're exporting this app right here as default. So if anybody imports our app.js file here, they will get this object back. That's kind of how default works. It's the default export. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And that pretty much wraps up our main app.js file here. And you know, actually, we're going to change this name. We're going to rename it to index.js. And the reason we're going to do that is because with these default exports, when you import something, you could just put the folder name and it will get the index file within that folder. So we're going to rename this to index.js just to avoid any complications. So now then, we've got a couple things here that we haven't done yet. We've got a config and we've got routes. So let's go ahead and set that up now. So for our config, I'm going to go ahead under the source folder and right click and say new folder. And we'll just call it config. And then underneath config, we're going to do a new file and we're going to call it index.js. Now this is what I was talking about with imports and defaults. Right here you see we've got import config from /config. Well, that's looking at this folder right here. And since we're using the import statement, it's going to look to the index.js file inside that folder. And that's what it's going to import. So we got our config file here. And this is just going to be a real simple file. We're going to export default. And we're going to export our port. And we're going to set it up to run on, just say 3005. That's not critical. But that's what we're going to, by default, it usually runs on 3000. But we're going to run it on 3005. And that's all we got to do here. We'll add some things in here later. But for now, that's all we've got. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. If we look back over here, we've got our routes again. So we need to set up our routes. So let's go back to our source folder. Create a new folder and we're going to call it routes. And then under routes, we need a new file. Index.js again. And so in here we need to import a few things. We need to import Express. We need to import our configuration. Now for this configuration, since we're in this routes folder, we've got to go up one folder and then to config. So the syntax for that is this .. to get back to this config folder. So basically we're going up one directory and then to config. Alright, we need, we're going to import middleware. And we're going to .. middleware here. We haven't created this yet, but we will be. And then we need, we're going to have a DB configuration file that's going to handle the connection. So I'm going to save this and we're going to jump over and create our DB config real quick. And I'm going to put our DB config on the same level as our index.js file here. So in our main source folder, I'm going to create a new file. We're just going to call it db.js. And in this config file here, we just need to import mongoose. And then I'm going to export default. And we're going to provide a callback here. And we're using a fat arrow function. And then inside this, we're just going to say let db equals mongoose.connect. And then here we're going to specify, You know what? Actually, let's specify this in the config file. So in our let's jump back over to the config file real quick. Let's lay this out. So let's add another property in here, and we're just going to call it Mongo URL. And then we're just going to specify a string, and the Mongo URL looks like mongodb : // and then we need to put localhost : 27017, which is the port that Mongo runs on, and then a / and then our the database name that we're going to use. So I'm going to put restaurant API there. Okay, so that should take care of that. Let me save it. And then we're going to come back over here, and we need to import our config here. Okay. And then right here where we say Mongo Connect or Mongoose Connect, we can say config.mongo URL. So that's going to actually connect to our database. All right. And then we need to go ahead and call the callback and pass in our database variable there. So this, when we call this, import this, we're going to connect to the database, and then we're going to pass the DB back to whatever imports it. All right. So where were we at? We're over in our routes. So in our routes, we need to import that DB. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to say import initialize DB from ... /DB. Now, the reason I named it initialize DB is because when I import this, when I use it, it's going to create the database connection. So here we could say let router equals express, and now we can connect to the database. So all we've got to do is say initialize DB, and then we're going to pass in, we're going to do a fat arrow function here and surround this with brackets. And then from here, we're connected to our database. We can use some internal middleware if we wanted to. Don't have to. And then we could specify our routes here. So for our internal middleware, we could just do something like app.use middleware, and then using destructuring, we could pass in config and DB here and leave that at that. And then anything we have in the middleware is going to get added in here. And we can specify our routes here, which we'll do in a minute or in the next video or something. Finally, after all this, we need to export this. So here we just need to export default router. So we're exporting the default, and we're exporting this router object here. And in just looking at that, I realized I made a mistake. We're using router, not app here. So that should be router.use and then our middleware. So we'll go ahead and save that and continue on. Now for our middleware, let's take a look at that. We're going to add a new folder here under source. And we're just going to call it middleware. And again, a new file called index.js. Alright, and inside our middleware here, we're going to import, and we're going to use destructuring to grab the router from Express. And then here, we're just going to wrap this up in a default export. And again here we're going to specify our config and our DB. And we're going to use a fat arrow function. And we're just going to say let API equals router. And then we could add middleware here if we wanted to. And then we're just going to return the API. Now that's all we've got there. We may or may not use this middleware file very much, but it's there if we need to. And in the future, we could always put some middleware in here and make use of it. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So we've got our database connection specified, and we began laying out our route file, our middleware, and our configuration. We've got our database config here in our actual connection, and we've got our base index.js file laid out here. So we're making good progress. When we get to /v1, it's going to take us over to routes, which gets sent to here. We've got to lay out our routes in the next video. So let's go ahead and move on, and we'll start adding in some routes and see how we can deal with processing. We'll see you in the next video.